I'm your host, Cheri Hudson-Passy from Carolina Girl Genealogy, and with me tonight I've got Laura Hedgecock from Treasure Chest of Memories. Hello, Laura.
Howdy, howdy.
And also our archive lady, Melissa Barker, is with us. Hey, Melissa.
Hello, everybody.
So good to have you guys here. Now, we haven't been on for a while. We've been doing other things or talking about other things, and we thought we would do a quick kind of a catch up on finding your roots. So, and there's only 3 of us that were able to come tonight. So you're gonna have to bear with us. So there was 5 episodes. We had episode 5, 6, and 7, and we're just going to quickly kind of go over them and talk a few minutes about records that may have been used, things we may have learned from that episode. I was saying before we started that I found it interesting that many of the celebrities on these 3 shows were talking about how important it was to see their ancestors in history and think about, oh, those paintings on the wall that I see, my ancestor could have been in there, or how it makes history so, it just comes alive when you know you had an ancestor that participated in specific things. And I know Melissa and I were talking about how much we didn't like history in school, but if we could have, been studying our ancestors during our history classes and learning that they were participating in all sorts of things that were going on, world events, whatever was happening in their community events, it would have made it so much more enjoyable, don't you think? Yeah,
I do. And, and as genealogists, knowing those events, knowing, especially like you said, in the community, especially, something that may have happened locally could explain why your ancestors did what they did.
exactly.
We
Yeah.
sometimes wonder, well, why all of a sudden did they move from here to there?
Right.
Why did they do this? Why did they do that?
Yep.
Start looking outside of your family and looking at the community.
Right. It's that push-pull factor is what they call it.
Yes.
Push-pull factor.
There's
We'll see that in one of the stories tonight.
And there's even, our country's our country is still kind of divided north and south, but even not during the Civil War, but during the 30s and 40s Depression era, many people from the South went north for work.
Yep.
And so, there's just so much to look at other than just following those census records, just following those main records. You've got to go outside the box and look. So
and really look, get away from that low-hanging fruit and actually dig and see what you can find. Well,
I will add to that though.
Yeah, do.
This is my new soapbox, I think. Those rabbit holes are a lot of fun when you go down there and you start like asking, like, well, why would that have happened? And just allowing yourself just to have some hobby research. It's not really
yes.
And you learn stuff that you've never known before, and your ancestors were impacted by it or involved in it. It's very interesting.
I agree with you, and I think it especially helps when you're really stuck and you're frustrated and you're stuck somewhere. Just kind of divvy over and go down those rabbit holes, and it kind of gives you some excitement, and then you can go back to that project that was frustrating you with maybe more joy for the work, so yeah, but just don't get stuck in the rabbit holes forever. And never get back and get your family's questions answered. So
ADHD guide to research.
There you go. Absolutely. Well, Laura, you were going to tackle from episode 5, Eliza Schlesinger, and so take it away. What did you
okay, I'm looking at my notes instead of the camera.
Okay. That's okay. We're all going to have to.
Well, it was interesting because they pretty immediately, they took her great-grandparents, who were Esther and Morris. And they showed her a census record here in the US. But then he started talking about how they had immigrated from what is now Poland. It was like Plock. It sounded like Plock the way they said. I would have said in German. But he said it was really hard to find any evidence of Jewish people that have left. And we all know that. And they just really aren't keeping records. So they found a birth record for Esther, and she was born in 1900.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
That
went
was quite a find. Yes.
right. And so they found that she was one of, I think it was 10 children,
Mhm.
but basically she was in part of what they call the Congress of Poland, or the Pale of Settlement.
Yes, yes.
And Jewish people had to pay higher taxes, and they couldn't get any education. So
Mhm.
it was kind of a grueling existence for all of
Yes.
them.
Right.
And
They showed the photo of that ghetto. I mean, to
Mhm.
see photos of, oh,
yeah, it was so sad. And then Esther was working as a dressmaker, but by the time she was 22 years old, in 1921, she paid her own passage to immigrate to America.
so fabulous.
So brave.
And amazing. But I don't know if they kind of then went to Bob. What's Bob's last name? Odenkirk. And then they came back
Odenkirk.
to her, but I'll just stick with her.
Yeah.
The bad thing was, though, he did talk about what happened with her siblings, or not all of them,
Yes.
but he talked about Esther had a sibling named Lipa, and he was assigned to a ghetto in, I just wrote it phonetically, Mawara, is a ghetto. And they talked about, she was really having a bad moment with it. And he basically, Dr. Gates is like, yeah, this just went from something that was abstract to
Mhm.
concrete. And
Exactly.
this is why you're having trouble, because you've always known it, but
But here it
knowing
is.
that
Yeah.
family
Here are the
connection.
records, right?
Yes. And so they found that unfortunately in 1942, Lipa was transported to one of the death camps,
Mhm.
and obviously never heard
Absolutely.
from again.
Right.
Well, he had Avram was another brother, and by 1931, he actually managed to get himself to France. Now that wasn't a get out of jail free card, because 20% of Jews that went to France were still exterminated. But they found records of him in 1955,
Yeah.
and he went to the US.
Yeah. So
So then they
amazing.
walked her through it and had her imagining, what would it have been like for Esther, who had
Yeah.
1921
Yeah.
left for America, and then to see her sibling in 1955.
Exactly. Exactly.
And I don't, obviously they don't know how long it was before any of the siblings could make contact after the war. But I'm
Right.
sure during the whole 30s and all of that.
Must have been so difficult. But the point I think that was made too was that your decisions to stay or go, I mean, just change lives and generations. Those decisions, do I stay, do I go? And somebody had said, well, if it wasn't for my ancestors staying alive, I wouldn't be here,
That
and
is true. And I think Bob said that, but also she had a grandfather. Now, I don't know if it was on that line, but she had a grandfather, Benjamin, who actually served in World War II.
yes. Yes. Isn't that amazing?
So you just, it's like in another
Yeah.
time portal. You know what I mean? That they were around in the same
So
area.
here he was trying to win this war, to free these people, to get them out of these camps. And there was somebody related to him through marriage, in a camp nearby.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah. But I
oh,
thought my big takeaway was really the concrete versus abstract, and kind of what I said earlier, that, and I know with all my friends who are Jewish, that they are very, very aware of all the things that happened.
oh yes.
And I'm sure it took some trepidation for her to go in there, and because she knew, what are the chances?
Yeah. What are the chances?
Going to trace
Absolutely.
my ancestry. There's going to be some bad news.
Yeah, exactly.
But in a way, I mean, it was somehow uplifting to see her, connect with this Esther and Morris. Now, when he said, do you think your grandfather knew that Avram and some others were in
Oh.
France. And she said, well, they never talked about it. Maybe they didn't know.
Yeah.
But I also know a lot of people, a lot of families don't talk about the
They
Holocaust.
don't talk about it. Nope.
So what she and her husband knew and what their son may have known when he went off to war, it might not have been passed down because people tended to be very tight-lipped.
Exactly. I mean, how many episodes have we watched where people have said nobody said anything? I mean, almost every episode, one of the celebrities says, we didn't talk about, I don't know anything. We didn't talk about it.
I think
So
many of us as genealogists can actually relate to that. I mean, how many of us have family members that are still living today that don't talk about it?
exactly.
Yeah, and it's not that they went through the Holocaust or went through maybe,
Yeah.
they just, I don't know. It's just, I don't know. I think us as genealogists, we talk about it all the time with everybody that will just listen. And so,
Exactly.
for us to hear someone say, well, we used to talk about it, or it's not that important. Like my husband's grandmother used to always ask me, why do you want to know about that stuff? But I'd ask her questions,
Yeah.
because it's not their thing, or they're not interested in it, or they don't see it as something interesting. They
Exactly.
lived it.
Yes.
That was that. We moved on,
Yeah. Why would my
but
life be interesting to you? Yeah.
yeah. I mean,
Exactly.
Yeah,
so
I was just reading, and that's kind of a tangent, I'm warning you, but I was just reading an article, and it was about oral histories. And one of the things that they were doing is they were having teens go in and talk to older people. And they were saying they got better oral histories and things that if an adult had gone, they wouldn't have got, because they didn't share the same kind of benchmarks of history. So there was more questions and more explanations instead of like, so where were you when JFK? They were kind of like, what, everybody knows what they were doing? They just got a different interview, a different
That
story.
is very interesting. So
Isn't that
maybe
fascinating?
different generations, not your children or something. Maybe it needs to be grandchildren or even great-grandchildren that would go in and start talking to get that information.
And the other thing that I thought was really cool was watching Dr. Gates, who obviously has a totally different background than this comedian from California. But there was just this honest meaning. He's like, I'm a Black man. I know what it's like to feel like you're different.
Yeah.
To always be something else.
Yep. Exactly.
Them finding that commonality to be able to discuss these really tender discoveries, these little vulnerable discoveries, and to process them. I thought it was a very good interview.
I did too. I did too.
Very good.
I really did. Let's move over to Bob Odenkirk. Sorry, saying his name. He came in saying, I'm Irish Catholic, and this is what I want to find out. So he didn't know much about his father. His father was an alcoholic and left the family very early on. But he knew his mother. His mother was Irish. And then they found out, wait a second, your mother has French.
That's why we do genealogy research.
That's exactly why we do genealogy research. And he was just, what? Never heard of being from France. And so I thought that was really interesting. They showed him a ship manifest, which we all would love to have, wouldn't we? Showing our ancestors coming from wherever they've come from to the United States. So I love that they showed him that. His fourth great grandfather actually fought in the Napoleonic Wars. You had to, when you were 18, you were conscripted and had to fight. And he was really taking all that in. And he was saying, I've seen pictures and paintings and all that, and never thought that would have anything to do with my family. Well, his ancestor, they found a pension record for him, and it turns out he got shot in the hand and he lost a finger and injured the other finger on his hand, and
he lost dexterity somehow.
And so they said he was shot in the hand, and so he was no longer able to serve. He was discharged and with the pension, but he was only like 22 years old. So that's a lot when you're 22, and most people at that time period had to work with their hands. So He did marry. He actually married twice, lost both of his wives, one to childbirth and one that died, probably of some kind of illness. They didn't say what. And then he died when he was 53, and his obituary said he drowned. Like, how sad is that? But yeah, I
He
think
was by a bridge. It was like, did he fall? I mean, they didn't
I
really say,
know they didn't tell us anymore.
stumble and fall in. Was
I was like,
he?
whoops. How did he drown? We want to know. On his father's side, they did do his father's side, although he didn't know much about his father, and he was from Germany, and he knew that. He knew his father was from Germany. And they were able to get a from the church archives, they were able to get a marriage record from 1778. And that always blows my mind when they can get things back from that far. Because I just have a hard time. My people are still stuck in South Carolina. So. But what they discovered was something really fun. And they discovered, okay, so they discovered that he was related to this Duke. And
The Duke of Boone.
yeah, thank you. And so this Duke was having an affair. He had a mistress. And so Bob is a descendant of this mistress. And they found this marriage promise record that said that if his wife died, then he would marry the mistress. Like, what on earth? And I'm wondering how the wife felt about that. You know, if I die, he's going to marry her because here's the document that says so.
But Bob Odenkirk liked that because first
Yeah.
he's like, oh wait, there was a power disparity here. I'm not
Yeah.
down with it.
So it wasn't
Royalty,
rape.
and
It
you got-
wasn't,
yeah.
yeah. And
He's
so
like, oh the guy really loved her.
yeah, because they had like what, 5, 6, 7 children together. So I thought that was quite interesting. And so it turns out, you know, that relationship means that he is related to the royal families in Europe. And he's actually 11th cousins to King Charles.
There you go.
King Charles III. So how funny is that? You know,
What
That's
I
fun.
thought was hilarious was I was looking at all these faces. I didn't see similarities, but
he was seeing them.
Charles and me. Yep, we got the same.
Yeah, because it was showing him all those photos. Sometimes I think we see what we want to see.
It's a male chin. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I think his story was kind of fun. I think he learned some things that it's gonna help him, I think, maybe have a better understanding of his dad and that side of the family. And always helps to go back and see where people came from and what may have helped them make the decisions that they made, and kind of put some peace to things that aren't so happy in your family history.
Let me ask Alice something. If
yeah.
you could go back to when you were a beginning genealogist,
Uh-huh.
tell yourself at the time, okay, this is not going to be straightforward.
Yeah.
Don't assume anything.
Right.
You know, look for the unusual or the impossible, or
Right.
because a lot of these things that you find out later in your ancestry, you think I would never have guessed that, or I can't believe it, that my family history took me this way.
Yes.
You know, and
that's
I
what we
think
were finding, you know, on
Mhm.
these episodes.
Yeah.
And I think if I could go back and tell myself, what I would tell myself is do better at the interviews. I interviewed,
Yes.
but I didn't ask all the right questions. There are questions that why didn't I ask that question? It was
think we
simple.
assume
Are they
that
the wise?
Well, like my maternal grandparents, why did they go to the next county to get married? They were both of legal age. They could have gotten married in the county where they were. Why did they go? And did any family go with them? Because her parents had passed away. His parents were still alive. The only thing I could think of is this county was kind of in the middle. Maybe they just decided they'll meet in the middle and get married so that his parents can come down from North Carolina, her sisters. But I don't know, but why didn't I ever ask? That's
Now I'm
there's
trying
an
to
old
think.
story
I know
that
I grew up in Spartanburg, and I know people went up to North Carolina to get married, and no, North Carolinians came down to. I think they had a waiting period.
yeah,
Mm.
but South Carolina.
And so they would drive to Spartanburg to get married, which I always
Yeah.
thought what is the most unromantic way you can start your your marriage? Drive to
Drive to
Spartanburg.
Spartanburg.
You know,
Melissa,
but it
what
could
were you
have
gonna
been
say?
something, it could have been something just so out of the box. And then there's a story that my husband tells all the time to use it as a reference to other things. But he talks about this mother and daughter. And this daughter, when she got married, was going to make a roast one night. And
Yes.
she got this roast and she cut off the end of it.
Yep.
And her husband says, "Why are you doing that?" She says, "I don't know. That's what my mother did. And this is what I do." And so when she asked her mother, "Mother, why do you do that?" She says, "Because I never had a pan that it would fit in."
Uh-huh.
I said, "That's not something we would think about."
No. Yeah.
And
So I
so we
have
got to
no
think
idea.
about,
Yeah.
yeah,
Why they went. It just to me doesn't make sense because
Well, you
they
think
weren't running away. They weren't running away. They were old enough to get married. And so I have no idea. But that's bugged me. I've asked my mom, do you have any idea why? I didn't even realize she said that they weren't married in Sumter, South Carolina. So
yeah, and yeah, but to
ugh,
your friend's story, Melissa, that's the other thing is we also have to be careful not to assign it too much meaning the other way.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
yeah,
they always cut the fat out. Well, no, we
yeah.
don't. All we know is that just they cut
That's right. Yep. Yeah. And I could throw all sorts of different ideas and woo, why did they
yes.
decide to do that? Did they run away? I have no idea why they did that.
No, and
So,
yeah, and sometimes it's hard to even. South Carolina's pretty good with fine historical laws, but
yeah.
I had a case
Just
in Ohio when I was just trying to figure out, like 1916, what the marriage laws were in
yeah.
Ohio versus Kentucky. And I
Yeah.
could, you have to go somewhere and visit an archive.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You archivists, you need to put more online, Melissa.
She's like, I'm trying, I'm trying, I'm trying.
Oh, if you only knew how much we had sitting on our shelves that you all need to either visit, which you can't, if you can't visit, I encourage you to research from a distance. I've done it for 34 years. My ancestors are from West Virginia, Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Maryland. I have visited Ohio in the past 34 years once and none of the other states. And I
Yeah.
have been very successful with my research by using email and phone calls. It
Yes,
can be done. It
exactly.
just
It can
takes
be
a little
done.
longer, it takes more
Yeah.
patience, but you can do it.
Right.
Yep. Exactly. Well, Melissa,
Yes.
we're going to talk about Jesse Williams. Tell me,
Yes.
tell me how you felt about his episode.
Well, Jesse, the Jesse Williams and Sonny Heston episode
Mhm.
was very interesting because both of them they both come from a mixed race
Yes.
couple, and so it was very interesting to hear their stories because it's like
Uh-huh.
they had two totally different genealogies,
Oh
you
yeah.
know.
Oh yeah.
And so, but anyway, Jesse Williams comes from an African American father and a European mother, a white European
Ah,
mother.
yeah, it was
And it's actually
Swedish, wasn't it?
Scandinavian.
Yeah,
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 actually Scandinavian.
yeah.
And so his mother is from Sweden. Her family's from Sweden. And his second great grandmother, which I absolutely loved this story, loved it. Anyway, his second great grandmother was named Inga Sophia Ekstrom. What a name.
Yeah.
She was a gifted singer. And I want us
Yeah.
as genealogists to think about talents and
Yeah.
hobbies that our ancestors had. Now,
Yeah.
it's very difficult to find documentation of that.
Sure.
However, we're humans. We all have our own talents, our own
Mhm.
gifts.
Mhm.
And, most all of us have hobbies, things that we're interested in, whether it's genealogy, sewing, whatever it is.
Mhm.
Anyway, she was a gifted singer. She actually went to the Royal Academy there in Sweden as a young girl. This is before she was married. She was part,
Did you catch him saying, I visited there and I have driven
yes,
by that
yes.
academy?
Yes, that's true. Yeah. He said, I never realized that I had an ancestor that was part of that academy.
Yeah,
But
so fun.
and of course they didn't go into what records they found to tell them this, which I would have been really interested because
Me
this kind of
too.
information is not something that you find very easily.
Yeah. Yeah, I would like
Uh
to know that too.
yeah. But she was part of a group called the Swedish Ladies Quartet, and they even had photographs.
Yes, which was
And
the
for him,
best.
yeah, and he didn't know about all this, so I'm wondering where they got the photographs. There must be, I'm thinking there's probably an archive in Sweden that
Yeah,
has these, or maybe the Royal
probably.
Academy itself has got
Yes.
an archive.
Yeah.
So she was part of this quartet. Well, then what did they do? They traveled. They
Yeah.
traveled the world. I actually right now have a lady that's coming into my archives. Her father was a musician, singer, owned his own record label from our county, which is unbelievable, as small as our county is. And he was part of the Grand Ole Opry and everything. Well, she's writing a book about him. And she's coming to my archives looking through newspapers, trying to find any kind of,
Yeah.
stories about him. So it's pretty cool. But not only did she travel the world, but then she came to the United States.
Yes.
You think about, okay, well, my ancestor got on a boat and immigrated to the United States. Well, maybe not. Maybe they got here some other way.
Yeah.
So I don't know that she had in her mind to
To
immigrate
stay
here,
and to stay.
or even to
Yeah.
stay. But anyway, she was performed at the New York Philharmonic.
Mm-hmm.
Think
Amazing.
about a young girl at this time. Women were always talking about how women, didn't have the right to vote, they couldn't own property, all these different things. But think of her and what she accomplished in her young life. And this is an example for us as genealogists. I find that a lot of genealogists start researching their female ancestors once they get married.
Yes.
Many of our female ancestors had whole wonderful lives and stories
Exactly, they
before
did.
they got
Yes.
married. So you should go back and research those times. So performed at the Philharmonic. Well, then she ended up settling in Minnesota
Mm-hmm.
and getting married and having children.
Yes.
But she had to give up. She gave up the quartet and the professional singing, in the public, but she did not give it up
Yes.
totally.
Well, they kind of tried to make it sound like, well, women, they wouldn't let them do things like that in those days. I don't think that's what happened to her at all because she
No.
was
Well,
teaching and
I didn't see it. Did she like pair up with Lawrence Welk or something? Like, you're talking about Minnesota here. Like,
No, she was a music teacher. She was teaching music,
Yeah.
but she was also giving solo performances. And this is after
Yeah.
she's married.
Yeah.
So kudos to that husband.
and what year was
Exactly.
this?
What year was this? I would say wasn't this like before 1900? I would say
Yeah.
1890s, wasn't it?
Something
Oh,
like that. Yeah.
wow.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah. And see, that's what they were making those assumptions that we have said time and time again. Don't make assumptions. And their assumption was, oh,
Right.
she had to quit performing because she got
Yeah.
married and
No,
she had to be a wife and a mother. She may have enjoyed being a wife and a mother, but knew she couldn't travel because she had the children. It was time to stop that, but she didn't give up her love of music
that's right.
and was able to teach
Mhm.
and
That's right.
and perform. And I thought, let them tell the rest of the story before you start making assumptions about
That's
what
right.
she did.
So look for your ancestors' hobbies, their interests, and things like that. Look
Yeah,
for them. Look in the records you already have first.
right.
There might be something in there. Look for that. But
Newspapers will say,
yes,
so and so was singing. That's how I found some of my female ancestors. They played the piano at graduations, or they sang at
yes.
graduations.
They were the high school play, or
Yeah, all those kind of
yeah,
things.
anything.
And
So
then look
that
at
was an interesting.
inventories. I'm sorry. And
Go
look
ahead.
for inventories too, because will inventories, a lot of times you can find musical instruments and things like that in there and think, oh my gosh, somebody in the family played that.
That's right.
Sorry, Melissa, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you're good. So that was a fascinating story. I truly enjoyed
Mhm.
that one. So then they moved to his eighth great grandfather on his father's side. Joseph Herrick, I think was his name. No, I'll take that back. This was not on his father's side. Yeah, was it his father's side or his mother's side? He was the
I'm,
one who was in Salem, Massachusetts. He was a constable during
yes,
the
I
Salem witch
think
trials.
that was on his, I want to say that was on his, no, that was on his mother's side. Yeah.
Okay,
We
his
haven't
mother's
gone
side.
to the paternal. Yeah, yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
so we're back into the
That was
1600s now.
amazing story.
Yes, yes. And so you think, we talk about the fan club. Thank you, Elizabeth Shawn Mills. But the fan club, the friends, associates, and neighbors. I research everyone. If there is a witness on a document, or
Mhm.
there is a bondsman, or a sheriff, or a constable, or someone else on, research them. They may connect to your family.
Yep.
You may find them a thread with them
Mhm.
within your family. So
Mhm.
he was a constable. And of course, he was there during the Salem witch trials. His name was on several of the documents
Wow.
that prosecuted the witches at the time, and
Yeah,
even the ones that
the
that
famous ones that we know about, that
yes,
we hear about all the time. He went
uh-huh,
and served the warrants and arrested them.
yes, and some of those were killed. They were hung for
Even
what they were
even
accused of.
Right, even his own sister-in-law.
Yes.
He
Yes.
arrested his own sister-in-law for being a witch.
And then
So,
the thing that really puts a dot on the I, I guess, is the fact that this ancestor owned slaves.
yeah,
And of course, Jesse Williams, descends from an African
right.
American father. So, when you have
And that
he
was in
owned slaves.
1714 Massachusetts. And that's why I'm
Yes.
always telling people it's not just a Southern thing. When you are
No.
researching,
Oh, that's
anybody
very true.
could
Yeah.
find records of the enslaved. We always assume that it's that right
Hmm.
pre-Civil War thing when things were getting so bad and it's only in the South. Well,
That's right.
no, from the time this country began, people were enslaving people. And
Hmm.
so, so I think that was a shock to him to know that they were talking about somebody from Massachusetts and found out that he was an enslaver. I think that really shocked him because they
Yeah.
weren't talking about anybody in the South. And so I really
When he
think
had
it
even
shocked
mentioned
him.
at the beginning of his story how he already has this experience with Southern and Northern,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because his
With
his
his
white North
parent.
family was in the North and his African
Right.
American family was from the South. But so then
Right.
he talks go then we do go to his father's
Mm-hmm.
ancestry, and I can't remember that I didn't write down his name, but his great grandfather left his family,
Yes.
but we've seen this so many times,
Mm-hmm.
and went and raised another family.
Yep. Yep.
We've seen this so many times, and I just think it has to do with
Yeah.
the fact that back then you just couldn't trace people like you can today, maybe.
Oh, yeah.
Because it
You could.
happens more times than I ever would have dreamed that it's happened.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then we hear about his ancestor who was a slave. His name was July Hadley.
Yes.
He was born into slavery. They do find a plantation owner named Samuel Hadley that they
Mm-hmm.
believe owned July, and they actually come up with some probate records that
Yes.
minces July. And
Yes.
and it's not like a name like James or Mary. A name
Right.
like July, I mean, you can almost guarantee that's probably him,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
those records.
Unless you go through other records and see that that was a popular name, and sometimes you have to do that too.
True,
So,
true.
but yeah, I think they use a lot more documents this time, because people get upset, here they are on the slave schedule. That must be your
Yeah.
person. They added that we looked beyond into the plantation records because if you're doing African American research, you've got to look at those plantation records,
Yeah.
Laura.
If there's some that
I
exist, so you
think
need
they
to
Yeah.
look for
had
them.
like a little, also, I think at the very beginning, I was on the app, I saw it, but it just flashed something
Mhm.
about that there was something about there's been a lot of research done that will not actually be explained in the show or something like
I
that.
saw that. Yes, they're now starting to put that on there, and I think that's a good idea.
At
Yeah.
the very beginning?
To let people know as the show's
Oh,
coming on, to let
yeah.
people know that there's been a lot of research done. We can't put it all on for you to see, but we're
And I
not
would
just
encourage
jumping to
anybody,
yeah.
that watches the show and I don't know in one aspect that it's there. I know that when I watch it, because I watch it on my PBS app on Roku, and I can like pause it. At
Yeah.
the end, I would encourage people who can do that. I don't know if you can do it on your
Mhm.
phone app or on the
Yeah,
computer,
they
but anyway, and it
If you've
lists.
recorded it, like if
We've
you
talked about
yeah,
it that you can
yeah.
see the repositories, the archives, the libraries and stuff that they
Mhm.
accessed um, at the end, like in the credits.
Yeah.
For two reasons. You can actually maybe go find the records that they talked about, or you can look for those archives and repositories that maybe you're researching your family in the same areas and this places
Mhm.
you've never even heard of. So
Exactly.
yeah, look for those.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So that was a great story. Was there anything else you
Hmm.
wanted to say about?
No, I didn't have anything else unless
Feel
someone wants
like
to
I
add
cut you
something.
off and I'm sorry.
You're
the
fine.
person that they found that was July, did he live long enough to be freed?
Yes, I
Yes.
believe so. Yes. Yes, he
They
did.
they don't know when he died, but they think that he died in the 1890s.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, he did. And he also, they found in the estate records, was him and his wife and his child. And that's why they knew it was him because it was that family unit.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so, that was
And then they
really
talked about
important.
some land too
Mhm.
that the family owned in, was it
It's in
Alabama or
Georgia,
Georgia? Georgia.
Georgia.
And he was actually, and Jesse was actually familiar with that property.
Yes, exactly.
So,
He said
yeah.
that's when we'd go back. That's where we'd go back to that area. And so that was important for him to, to do that. So he says he wants to go back and touch that land. So
Yeah.
Oh, that's, yeah, 'cause
yeah.
he'll think of it differently now.
Very
Absolutely.
differently. And that's what they're all finding. We're looking at history differently now than we're seeing that our ancestors were involved in all these things we've been taught all our lives in classes that happened. Our ancestors were part of it. And of course they were, but we don't tend to realize that as we're learning. We don't think about, oh, I wonder if my great grandma did this or grandpa did this while we're learning. So I wish they would incorporate, genealogy, family history research into history classes. I think wise teachers should do that, and I think that their students would get more out of it. Now, granted, there are some students are going to have issues, adoption issues. They don't know who biological family are, foster kids. Well, what you do is you either have them research their family that has adopted them. You have them find their favorite star. We could have a Taylor Swift kid, she might want to find out who Tay-Tay's family is. So they start researching anybody like that. They can choose somebody if they don't have somebody in their family that they feel comfortable with, but they can still do the research and make connections with history. So there's ways to do that even with that children that don't have biological family that they can research, or even an adoptive family that they can
Yeah,
research.
we've looked at it a few years ago. I looked at doing something with an elementary school. But part of the problem too is there's so many first generation families
True.
that
This is true.
so
Also,
what we came up with was
have
like
them find somebody else to do.
a family tree where it was just flags.
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
That this person came from here, and at least
Uh-huh.
but then finding resources to do
Right.
anything more when, I mean,
Yeah.
our school system has like 85 different languages spoken in the
Oh
school.
my goodness. Yes. Yes.
So,
Yeah.
but somehow to connect them with that whole, yeah, so what part of
Mhm.
history was that?
Yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think that's really great. Well, then they went to Sunny Hostin, who is a the word just right out of my head. She's on
She's a panelist on The View.
and but she's a journalist.
She's a very
what
accomplished
I'm looking
person.
for.
She's a very
She's a,
accomplished person.
yeah.
They do a lot of the front story, I call it, of these
Mhm.
celebrities, which is great because a lot of them I don't know.
Me
And I
too.
didn't know
Yeah,
her.
interesting.
And to hear her story, her own history.
Yeah.
And she was an attorney, and
Mhm.
and just like we talk about our ancestors, her life took a turn.
Yes.
And our ancestors' life takes turns that
Mhm.
are not necessarily documented.
Yeah,
And so
exactly.
that's why we have to be very open-minded about which way we have to turn with our research.
That's a good point.
You can't get it in your head, oh, well, they can only go this way, or they can only do
Exactly.
this.
Right.
Because, and Sunny's a perfect example of that. She was an attorney,
Yeah.
she was attending a conference, and someone
Yeah.
said, hey, you would be great for TV. It's like me, how
What?
I became an archivist. I became an archivist by happenstance. It was not
Yeah.
something that I sought after,
Yeah.
but it just
Yeah.
happened. And so, that's what we should be doing with our ancestors too.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. They start off talking about her maternal grandmother, who was from, or is, because she's still alive, I think, from Puerto Rico. But she said again, she would never talk about Puerto Rico. And she'd say to her,
Yes.
tell me about it, or I'm going to go visit, come with me. And she never could get her to go. She never could get her to go. And as they did more research, they pretty much, she was living in the barrio. She lost her parents and a couple of siblings before she was 11 years old. There was a lot of grief. There was a lot of
Yeah.
bad
A lot of
memories
pain.
there. And I'm sure that's why she didn't want to go back. That
Mhm.
she just couldn't do it. Then they went from her to her grandfather, and it turned out that her grandfather um, is from an enslaver family, and that didn't
That
sit
really shocked
well.
her.
That shocked her, and they were Spanish as well.
Yes.
And so that she did say, well, that's great because my husband's Spanish, so we have that in common. But
But
yeah,
she really
so
came to the table with a lot of preconceived notions of her family.
yes, she
And we
did.
and we do that as
Mhm.
genealogists, as people. We do that because we only know what we
Yeah,
know
that's right.
from what we
Yeah,
grow up to experience. And so, yeah.
exactly. So yeah, so her grandfather was the son of a slave merchant. And she did not know that. And that kind of threw her, which when you find things like that out, it really does. It really does, because it changes your whole perception of how you feel about your family. You've really got to deal with it, you
And I
know?
think too, and this is just historical, that I think it just happens this way, is a lot of people, her family's from Puerto Rico. I don't think she thought about slavery
Yeah,
there. She
yeah.
thinks, United States South,
And
you
yes.
know, and
Yeah,
and I can here to tell you that there was a slavery in many
yeah.
countries,
In many
in
countries.
many different time frames.
Yep.
And so will run into it at some point as
You just
genealogists.
may. You
Hmm.
just, you
So
just
prepare yourself.
may. Exactly, exactly. She had part of her family was in Georgia, and they found, what did they find for her? Trying to look at my notes. Um, oh, her third great grandfather, after emancipation, took the name Cummings,
Yes.
and they found him several times registering to vote. It was like nine
Yes.
times he had registered to vote. He registered to vote even though the KKK was out there
Yep.
telling people, you try to register to vote and we're coming after you. They were killing people, they were threatening people. And she just loved it. She says, my family this is the type of family I have. We don't stop fighting.
She was
So
very brave
yeah,
because that
very
was a
brave.
very scary time.
Yes, it was a very scary time. And so um yeah, I think that helped her come back after finding out the other news. I think it helped her to be able to have a more positive um outlook about family in general. And he had registered to vote by making his ex, and so it was just wonderful that he kept going back 9 times to do it. I thought that was wonderful. So again, seeing that an ancestor lived within a certain time period where you'd heard it, she heard about um all that going on,
Hmm.
and the Ku Klux Klan back in that time period, and the dangers to African
Yes.
Americans, and then to find out that her family member stood up to it and went and registered to vote. That must have been fabulous. Another wonderful way to see that your family was involved in history. I mean,
Yes.
they all were, but to see it in documents,
Hmm.
I think was wonderful. Now, I know you said you didn't get to see the Dionne Warwick, but
Yeah.
fun fact and trivia, who knew that with her first album, they messed up her name?
Hmm.
She's not Dionne Warwick. She is Dionne Warwick. They changed her, she said,
Oh.
from a Rick to a Wick. And she got really, really upset. And she said her grandpa just said to her, darling, just use it as a stage name. It's really fine. You can
And
be,
that's another thing because Sunny had an issue with her
yeah,
name.
yes. They
Uh,
couldn't say her name. And so
yeah,
they just said, we're gonna have to figure out another name. And as soon as her name was changed, she said,
she famous.
yeah,
Yeah.
because it was easier for people to
So
read.
look for those name changes in your family history, no matter
Yeah,
how slight. I
yeah.
actually worked with the local family here where we live. They have owned our grocery store for over 100 years. They just recently sold it, by the way. So the names has changed on it, but it's been the
Aw.
same named Piggly Wiggly for 100 years.
Piggly Wiggly. I love Piggly Wiggly.
Anyway, so I
I
worked
like
with
saying Piggly Wiggly. So you people that are not from the South, you're missing out because you can't go shop at the Piggly Wiggly.
well, so anyway, so the there's two sons that were running it and they sold it. But anyway, their father, I worked with him on his research, and their last name is Cleghorn, Cleghern. And as
Mhm.
I worked with him, he told me, he says, our name was originally Cleghorn,
Oh,
Horn.
which would make more sense.
And so we got to talking. I said, well, how did it get changed? He says, well, let me tell you the story. His great grandfather was a real big penny pincher, and he ordered stationery, and it came in spelled wrong, and he refused to send it back. And from then on, the name was spelled differently.
See?
See?
Wasn't even changed at Ellis Island.
No.
We know is the myth,
No,
but
We have never been able to figure out why the Hitchcocks, some of them became Hedgecocks and some of them are still Hitchcocks. And it would be two sons would be Hedgecocks and two sons would be Hitchcock from the same family.
so funny. It's so funny. We just don't know why they do what they do,
No.
right?
Yeah,
Well,
whether was it just like you said, someone just started spelling it wrong,
spelling
or
it wrong in her case, which I thought was so funny. Now they started with her family that was from Florida. And of course, it took her back to the time of her ancestors that were enslaved. And they did the same kind of thing. They pulled out the slave schedule and they didn't, I don't think they did as good of a job with her. It was more that here's a slave schedule. Here's people that were about the same age as your ancestors were. This must be, you are looking, he said, at your ancestors. And I'm thinking, please tell me that you did more research, because you can't tell that from that. Because sometimes you can look at those slave schedules and your people aren't there that day because maybe they were rented out. Maybe they had run away. Maybe they just got miscounted. You can't, you can't. You need more records. They did look at the plantation records of the enslaver. And it was this might be your people in this record. So I'm sure that they had more information, because why would you want to give people false hope and false information? What I did like is they were showing them maps of where the plantation was. On each of these cases, they were showing them the actual maps of where that plantation would have been, where, if in fact these were their ancestors, this is where they would have been enslaved. And so, people could go and visit. They showed her the picture of the enslaver. That was kind of an interesting, because we've seen it before. They'll show this is the picture of who we believe enslaved your people. She says, he's just an ugly man.
I didn't see it, so I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's just so funny. I mean, she was just, he's just an ugly man. And I'm thinking, gosh, I hope nobody's watching that's their ancestor, because that's kind of tough and hard.
Well, at least she was honest about
But at
it.
least she was honest about her feelings about that. And it
That's
was
right.
something that she really hadn't thought about a lot. And so to actually see the face of the man that enslaved her family, I'm sure was not pleasant. I'm sure it was not pleasant. And she made that known. I think if we saw a picture of anybody that we felt inflicted harm on our family,
That's
we
right.
would not have good feelings about that person. Not at all. So what I'm hoping is that maybe, because she's able to know that now, who they think is the enslaver, maybe those descendants of that enslaver can get together with Dion and they can work together and see what else they can come up with. Because you have to, when you're doing African American research, you have to go through those plantation records and see what you can find.
Yep.
You have to help each other. And
Right.
so maybe that can, with the descendants, maybe that can help kind of bring some peace to that situation. Because I know it has with the research I've done with the descendants of enslavers. It really has helped to be able to make those connections and not judge one another, and kind of get rid of that negative feeling, because what you're doing is trying to help each other find family.
Right.
Especially when you're genealogists, it seems to work better when they're genealogists and we understand those records. So I hope for her sake that she can do something like that. I think it'd be very beneficial. I mean, I don't
Yeah.
know how many records they actually found for her. And the same kind of thing happened with her family. The KKK came in and they were so violent in her community, in this community in Florida, that the ministers in town were saying, we need to leave.
Mm.
We need to leave. Our people need to leave. This is a dangerous situation. And he says to her, so what do you think? Do you think your people left? She went, no. And they didn't. They stayed. And so she says, yeah, that's the kind of people we are. We would stay. Now, interesting thing is that her grandfather's name was Nish.
Mm.
And she remembered him having a really, really wonderful voice. So that's probably where she got her voice from. And I think we all know that she's an aunt of Whitney Houston. They're
Yes.
connected. Yeah. So the singing runs in that family. Well, he ended up in the 1920s or 1910s having land. So not too far after emancipation, he owned a good sized piece of land growing cotton, and it was his own land, and they showed her the map. It was a big piece of land. But by the 1920s, they were then in Newark, New Jersey. And so you start to think of that push and pull. What could have happened? Well,
Yeah.
what they explained was during that time period, the boll weevil came in and was
Mhm.
destroying crops in Georgia.
Yes.
He ended up having to file bankruptcy on his land, and they ended up leaving. And also, that is a time period too where a lot of African Americans were leaving to go up north. It's called the African
The great
American,
Mike.
just the Great Migration,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
African American
Yeah.
diaspora, where they're
Diaspora,
moving.
that's it.
Yep,
Yeah.
they're moving out of the South and North and West. So all those things
And what time
combined
frame
to,
do we have a time frame on that? What years that was happening?
it started happening a lot after World War One, because things were opening up. Then after
Mm.
World War II was another big, so there was different migration time periods depending on what was happening in the world,
Right.
transportation, and people could afford to drive. They were going for jobs that
Mm-hmm.
were opening up in the West and then in California as
There's
more jobs.
a lot of people
Soldiers,
in the Midwest too.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
As
soldiers
industry
would come
took off.
home. Yeah, soldiers would come home from the war after being based in the West and wanting to go back.
Mm.
So there was a great period of African Americans, Mexicans, a whole Hispanic people, a whole bunch of different groups that moved during that time period. So, and so that's one of those push and pulls
Yeah.
that makes people move. And we need to learn about that. We need to research what was going on in the area. And of course, he said we can't prove that's why they left and went there. But that would make sense if if he lost his land and people were
Mhm.
moving, that's where he would go. It showed in 1930 that he was then a metal worker, so he'd gone to work in the factories, which is what happened to a lot of the farmers. They went north and became workers industry workers in the cities. Um,
And I want to tell y'all something too.
uh-huh.
When you find that your ancestor moved like that, migrated like that,
Mhm.
um, look at the friends, associates, and neighbors. Look at the neighborhood.
See
The
if they
reason I'm
all
saying
went.
that is the reason I'm saying that is because here in Houston County, Tennessee,
Mhm.
I recently, a few years ago, I learned because I knew that my husband's family and many people from this area went to Detroit, they went
Mhm.
to Illinois, they went
Mhm.
to places in Missouri for work, especially during the Depression era.
Yeah.
But when I had a couple came in, a daughter and a mother came into my archives one day, and I was talking about this, and they said, "Well, where did they live?" And I named the street that my husband's grandparents lived on when they lived in Michigan
Mhm.
and in Detroit. And they said, oh, she says, that was called Houston County Street. And I said, no, it was this name street, Morrell Street. And they said, no, everybody in Houston County rented houses on that street,
Huh,
I
a
believe it.
whole
interesting,
street. And so,
interesting.
the look at that
Yeah.
kind of aspect when
Oh,
you're
yeah.
looking at that migration pattern, because I mean, it was nothing for them to go in the wintertime to Michigan or Illinois, wherever work, then come back to their properties in summer, farm, and then go back, and then they would go back and forth,
Mhm.
back and forth. Even my
Yeah.
husband talks about as a kid going back and forth.
Isn't that interesting?
It is.
Well, she knew her grandfather was musical. But in the 1940s, he started a musical group. The family started this musical group called the Jubilee Singers, something like that. And they recorded one of the very first gospel records. So she's got that in her family history. And then in the 50s, they were background singers for the likes of Elvis Presley and other big name singers. So that's really cool. They just continued um, that tradition all the way through the 70s. They were singing, the group was singing. So how fun is that? How fun is that? I'm sure she probably knew all of that, but
Yeah.
those of us that know her and her music, we don't know those types of things. So then the last person we need to talk about is Danielle Brooks, who is an actress, and she was looking for the same thing. She's African American and wanting to know her family. And she discovered that she had an ancestor that actually fought for the US colored troops.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very cool. She was very, very happy about that. And they showed a letter, and we've talked about this a couple of times, that your ancestor may not have written a diary, written a letter, written anything,
Mhm.
but other people in their
Yes.
units or wherever they lived may have. And so there was a letter that was written by one of the soldiers in his unit and described some of the battles and described the horrors of the war. And I mean, he was in several of the major battles, and a couple of them where the Union lost. And they lost many people. So, but he made it through. He made it through. And she says, you know what? Knowing this changes the game for my family. I
Mhm.
thought that was really cool. It
Yeah.
changes the game for my family. So he returned home to Memphis after the war and was a farmer and had a lot of children. And so that was interesting for her to find out about that, because she had, of course, no idea that happened. On her maternal side. Again, they went to the slave schedule to a planter by the name of Sharp, because her fifth great grandparents were Fraser and Susan Sharp, and so they jumped to the Sharp name, which a lot of people do. And I mean, it's a clue, right? It's a
Mhm.
clue, but the statistics show that so many did not take on the enslavers'
Yeah.
names. You've got to be really careful and not assume.
Yes.
This is hard research, because there's a lot of assuming and
And
myths
as much
about.
as you want to just grab onto that, try
Mhm.
to not do that. You really
Try to
need to
not do
do the
that.
research. Yeah.
Right. Look and see what kind of records you can find. Look throughout the whole community. What other enslavers were there? Can you find similar names in their records?
Mhm.
What can you find? When I was doing research on a man that my ancestor fathered, an enslaved man, I found his records not in and his last name is Gibson. So you think, oh, I'm going to go look at all the Gibson records because he took the name Gibson and he was supposed to be his father. I found his family's records in his father-in-law's will,
Mm.
who
Oh,
was not a
Yeah.
Gibson,
Mhm.
and so you've got to look around and see who was there at the time and start looking for all sorts of clues. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with starting with that name, but we just need to understand that name's changed. From 1870s to, the 1880 census, last name may have changed, because they kind of tried on different names. I mean, they were free. They could try on different names. Sometimes they would change their name to a previous slave owner where they had last seen their family. Because if they changed their name to that last name, maybe their family could find them
Yeah.
under that last name. And so there's
And
so
and don't be afraid
yeah,
to, if you can't nail down that name, don't be afraid to leave it blank.
yeah. Just keep
I
looking.
think sometimes we get afraid, if I leave it
Yeah,
blank, then he doesn't have a name, whatever. But
yeah,
if you
right.
sign that name, even for temporary purposes, it may get lost in the shuffle and then
Yeah,
it's there.
sure. Yeah, I would suggest going to the counties where you know that your family was enslaved and see if anyone else has been doing that research. Check the
Mhm.
genealogical societies, see what the plantation records are there. See if you can find descendants of the enslaver that may have records that can help you. Um, there's so many resources out there. And again, one statement was made that it's nearly impossible to find the records of the enslaved before 1870. And we know that's not true. We can find them. We just have to look for them. They're not easy pickings, but they're there.
Yes.
We can find their names. They're in those records. So and sometimes I don't want people to get discouraged when they hear things like that, because it's not true.
Yeah.
So but I know that they do really good work on the show, and they're doing great research, and they're trying to present these celebrities with the best that they can find, with the best documents that they can find. They did I think that try to yes, her ancestor also registered to vote, and that was really fun to see that too, as another relative that was registering to vote, and several times. So they weren't scared off either, and they registered to vote several different times. What else I was gonna say something, and then it slipped out of my mind because I read
Mhm.
this thing about about registering to vote completely. Oh, DNA. They did a DNA match with with Danielle Brooks, and it was Sterling K. Brown. If you guys watch This Is Us, I don't know if you watch This Is Us, then you know who Sterling K. Brown is. He's such a gentle, kind actor. And she said, I just saw him recently and I walked up behind him and I guess I scared him. And he looked at me and he said, Jiminy Christmas, what are you doing? He said of all the times he could have used some bad words or whatever. She said, what a kind man he is to say something like that instead of, some kind of swear word or something. So, yeah. So she was thrilled to find out that he was a distant cousin on her mother's side. So she thought that was really great. But how fun is that when they do
It's
that for the
fun.
celebrities? Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really fun. But again, seeing your family in the history of this
Mhm.
country,
Yes.
or coming to this country and being part of the history of Europe or whatever country, Puerto Rico, whatever countries that they've come from, to see how it affected them there, and then
Yes.
how they got to the United States, and how, but for the grace of God, they made it and they lived, and that we are here.
That's
I
right.
think it's amazing, and I think it's powerful.
And they
And
all have stories to tell. So get out there and tell those stories.
get out and yeah, tell your own stories. Your grandkids need to hear the stories, and
Hmm.
we need to not be telling our grandkids, oh, you don't need to know that. I don't want to
No.
talk about that.
Mm.
Because, and if you don't want to talk to them about it, write it down somewhere for them to find later.
Yeah.
Because they're
Because once
important.
you're gone, it's lost.
Once you're gone, it's lost. Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll never know why my grandmother went and got married in the next county over, when all of her sisters were in the one county and his family. It just doesn't make sense. It's going to drive me crazy until the one day I can see her again and say, I forgot to ask you a question.
Yeah.
And it's been bugging me for years.
And you
Anyway.
watch, it'll be something just so flippant and simple that it'd be like, yeah.
Oh, oh, Absolutely. It'll be
Yeah,
so
his car broke down, so I decided to drive.
Right.
Yeah, we were gonna go all the way to North Carolina and the car broke down and we just went in to the Justice of the
Yeah.
Peace, went ahead and got married there. I mean, I
Yes,
don't
we had the
know.
speeding ticket. We already had to go see the Justice of the Peace for the speeding ticket, so we decided to have him marry us.
Yeah, yeah, it just doesn't make sense to me.
I'm gonna write you like 12 different stories of why it happened.
So funny. Well, thank you, ladies. I know this was a lot to go through to kind of try to catch up and talk about these stories and how important it is to learn about our ancestors because of them we are who we are, and to learn about our place in history and their place in history and how it all so miraculously works together to get us here on GenFriends.
Right.
Which is amazing. And I appreciate you very much for being with me tonight. And so we would like to hear from you if you watch these episodes. What did you learn? What have you learned about your ancestor that was surprising that you didn't know through your research? What have you learned about history and the effects that it had on your family? And does it make history does it make it come alive for you as you learn about the events of the world and in the community and discover that your ancestors were part of it? We'd love to hear those stories, and we're grateful for your viewership that you watch us. And so don't forget to like us and leave comments and tell other people about GenFriends. And with that, we will see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye.